Special thanks to Affordable Prestige Cars for of course providing the BMW in this review, and if you are a fan of the series you will recognise their name of course. If you are on the lookout for something perhaps like this, a luxury and even performance 4x4 rolled into one, maybe something more expected in the prestige car sphere like a saloon, an estate car, maybe a collectible classic, they have all of those and of course more, so if you are interested in that you can click the link right below in the video description and check out their current stock. We need of course to address the thumbnail first. One you marry. What on earth does that even mean? Well, that was kind of the point of why I put it there. Not only is it eye-catching, but to me that is actually the way I would describe how I feel about this car. Because being as this one is a 2016 in particular BMW X5, which means it's an F15 generation version, and it ran of course from 2013 to 2018 in this particular form. So what do I mean with that thumbnail? Well, to me, we live in a day and age, especially now, when vehicles are somehow, and this is quite the dichotomy actually, simultaneously full of gimmicks. There are so many bells and whistles and crazy things and insane colours and crazy lap times, and it seems like every vehicle from some new random Chinese manufacturer is breaking a lap record somewhere. Some brand that used to make, I don't know, classic Grand Prix cars is now making electric hot hatches. Left, right and centre, there are so many gimmicks happening, and yet simultaneously there's very little soul in many of these cars. And the obvious answer is that many are electric, but it goes beyond that. Even the ones which aren't electric kind of look like they should be, and vehicles are simultaneously more gimmicky than ever, and yet kind of less personal, less individual, less unique, and less interesting. In other words, when you compare a vehicle which does have all of the bells and whistles to something which is more traditionally German, as we used to say, such as I would describe this car as being, it can almost seem underwhelming in comparison. It can come off as grey. If the colour was a car, it would probably be something like a BMW X5. It's just a big German 4x4. It's kind of everything you'd expect, and no frills, no extras, nothing particularly charismatic, but that's all on the surface. What about underneath? That brings us to the thumbnail. To me, this is like when you're looking for a potential partner, for whatever reason, long-term, short-term, someone who has quirks, an interesting looking style, something interesting about them visually. Well, that is initially eye-catching. It does seem appealing depending on your preference, and the visual aspect of being attracted to someone is the first thing that for most of you will see. On the other hand though, those aren't always conducive to a long-term meaningful relationship. Whereas if you compare the kind of partner that you would actually want to settle down with and be with for a long time, it's probably more so the kind of person that you'd think of in like a whimsical 1940s and 50s sense of being a steady individual, someone that you could just live with for literally decades upon decades and have plenty of fun and a great life, but they might not initially have the wow factor. That is exactly what I feel about this car. See, BMWs, and you can see this from my past reviews, they have this long-standing tradition almost of not really being cars that I care to drive that much. I'm not really a Beamer guy, and yet I find myself consistently impressed by what they can do. But here's the interesting caveat. It's always the diesels. The petrol ones are fine. You know, M2, M4, they are fun vehicles, but it's always the diesels that really impress me the most. High-performance diesels were the rage for a while, and that in itself has kind of gone away for the most part now, which I really do lament. I'm a huge fan of fast diesels. In the case of this particular car, it's a prime example of that. Despite being just about a decade old, depending on the model year you go for, this definitely pushed that diesel gimmick in, I would say, the way it should be pushed. It was a bit more restrained than something like the SUV I used to have, the V10 engine diesel Touareg, which was an absolute gimmick, but I loved it for it. And this is a bit more expected, a bit more sensible, but what it can do really does prove that diesel was cut short way before its time. Because consider this, it's got a very traditional sounding approach to a BMW engine. Turbo aspirated 3-litre inline 6, a straight 6 engine, sounds like a proper Beamer. Forget the fact that it's a 4x4, and then when you look at its spec, 380 horsepower, 544 foot-pounds of torque, that's over 730 newtons, which is plenty on any vehicle, let alone a 4x4. And get this, a vehicle which, in this particular form for example, has the optional 7 seats, itself something which was quite rare to find on many of the earlier 2000s SUVs, many of which, including the Touareg, which I love so much, were just strict 5-seaters, which kind of makes them a bit pointless if you really think about it. This was a proper 7-seater, and yet, with all of that size, that space, those seats, and being a diesel mind you, this has a 5.3 second 0 to 60 time. It's speed limited to 155, so it can do even more. Maybe the low to mid 160 mile an hour region, perhaps even a little more, and it has an 8-speed ZF gearbox, as all of these generation cars do. I believe even the X5M. So in other words, we're talking about a 7-seater, comfortably equipped, you would hope solidly engineered, being a BMW, example of a 4x4 which they'd already been successful successfully producing for over a decade before this had even come out, with great success, which can simultaneously out-accelerate something like a Maserati Quattroporte, and at the same time do up to 45 to the gallon on a motorway, and I would wager is probably more reliable than something like a Maserati Levante, or many other 4x4s on the market, as much as I hate to say that as a Maserati fan. Now, an interesting thing about this generation, the F15, is it's based on the same chassis infrastructure as the previous model, which was the E70, but because of the change in manufacturing, it actually weighs less. They use lighter weight construction materials, both inside and out, to save about 90 or so kilos over whichever version of the equivalent car was from the previous gen. So whichever engine you choose, it's about 90 or so kilos than what that one would have been last time around. In terms of space, well, that's a fascinating one to me, and this is another thing which is quite refreshing, particularly if you live here in the UK or anywhere in, Europe, or pretty much anywhere on the planet with old school roads that aren't as big, where this really will be an advantage. This car, particularly for example when you see it on the forecourt at affordable prestige, lined up next to Range Rovers, some older, some newer, even something like a truck like a Mitsubishi L200 or a Nissan Navara, this actually looks almost modest in size compared to them. In fact, it was smaller and lower to the ground than many of those vehicles next to it, and yet when you see in particular for me the first generation X5, it looks like a huge car, but it kind of just isn't. SUVs and 4x4s have gotten so big over the years. Just look at the latest, Cybertruck or that GMC Hummer. They are enormous vehicles now, and as much as I love that, it can be a bit cumbersome for some drivers, some roads, and some circumstances. In the case of this though, it's actually quite reasonably proportioned. It's 76 inches wide, which really isn't that crazy. It's only 70 inches tall at the roof, and it's only 192 inches long, which in other words in every way is not that crazy. And even in terms of weight, it's a good 200, 300, 400 kilos lighter than many Range Rovers, Cayennes, Tuaregs, and various other rivals. Why am I bringing all of this up though? Is it just about parking in Tesco's? Well, actually no. This is one of the crucial things which I think is really good about this car. And again, this is coming from someone who is not a particular fan of the X5. To me, the first generation was a really striking looking car, but I kind of lost interest, to be honest, ever since. The reason why this one brought me back though, and actually won me over, is because of that advantage. Because it sits a little lower, it's not quite as wide, it's not quite as long, and it certainly isn't as heavy. Plus, being BMW who's building it, and of course the fact that it is the M50d, so it's the performance version, it feels more like a car than a 4x4. And that is something which I've referenced here and there with other vehicles as well. But when you can find a 4x4 that feels like that, unless you're just buying it, as a regular family car, but if you are looking for something and you are more of a petrol head, more of a motoring fan, you like those kind of sportier dynamics and better cornering, this is the kind of vehicle which I think will very quickly win you over. Because gone is that typical kind of top-heavy feeling that some 4x4s can have. It doesn't feel wallowy at all. The responsiveness, of course, majorly because of that torque from the M50d spec engine, it's instant. It has this relentless acceleration. And one of the things I really like about the power and torque delivery, in particular this is an N57S engine incidentally, is that the power band hands off the baton between torque and power seamlessly. It feels fantastic on acceleration, and in real world applications it's not just launching off the line, it means for overtaking on a motorway or anything like that. It's just effortless. It is the definition of effortless performance, and if you consider the power bands, it makes sense. The peak torque is from 2 to 3,000 RPM, and then peak power is anywhere from 4,000 to 4.5. So you've got that near perfect crossover point with only a slight gap in between that in practice you don't even feel, to be honest, where when the torque runs out, which as any who like myself having that V10 prior, you can feel when the torque runs out, and that car didn't have a huge amount of top end horsepower, so it really did become sluggish once you were up around 60 or 70. This definitely doesn't. It almost feels like, the way I would describe it I think is like a diesel in the low end, and then almost like it becomes a petrol car in the top end. And that's some great engineering. In fact, it's great engineering much in the same way as why I love the 635d and the 640d, both other fantastic BMW diesels, and pretty much any BMW with those kind of engines I'm sure I would love as well. To me, this is a vehicle which is severely undervalued, but it's because it has that 1950s whimsical kind of image. It's not the flashiest, most flamboyant, most futuristic, crazy, ironically for BMW who made stuff like the i8, it's not the most forward-thinking looking car, but that's kind of the reason why it's good. It feels more traditional. In fact, it feels kind of like the peak of traditional. It feels like the end of an era. One of the last really good high-performance diesels before that went away and everything became quite soulless. It's not to say that they can't potentially have their issues. A very brief look online, and of course I would always recommend checking out owners forums, etc. And there are other creators who have done common fault style videos anyway, so look into that if you will. It looked to me though like many of the issues which these do have tend to be smaller electrical things, the kind of things which can happen really to any car. You know, child locks being funny every so often, or the boot maybe having a creak. And one other thing which I find fascinating when you compare this even to other X5s, and this really does highlight the point of just how much potential diesel has when you engineer it properly. Compare this to the top of the tree of the, I believe, petrol versions, if I recall, which is the xDrive 50i. That one has 444 horsepower and does 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. So in other words, that's a good 60 horsepower more than this, and it's only 0.3 of a second quicker. Then compare it even to the top of the tree, the X5M, which of course you'll be paying more of a premium for. That's a 570 horsepower petrol, and that of course has a 0 to 60 time of 4.2, which is about a second quicker than this. But that doesn't do 45 to the gallon, and also has that much more power, nearly a full 100 horsepower more, and nowhere near the torque in order to achieve that performance. So to me, this one is such a versatile mix between that kind of acceleration in particular, because let's be honest, you don't really need top-end speed unless you're literally on the autobahn. Great handling, great road holding. It's just a 4x4 or an SUV which doesn't have the frills. It doesn't do the gimmicks. It's not a flamboyant, flashy, colourful birthday cake. It's more like just a really good cheesecake. It's not as flash, visually speaking, but it tastes way better. And I think for someone who's looking for a solid, practical, dependable, modestly sized all-round choice of SUV or family car, but depending on the model that you choose, certainly here with an M50d, a properly quick car as well with some fantastic cornering dynamics and very powerful brakes, well, I mean, what's not to like? The understated looks wouldn't be for everyone, they're certainly not for me. I do like a wacky looking car, pretty obviously if anyone's seen my cars, but it's a very, very impressive all-round bit of kit. And as I said, it kind of does feel like the end of an era. For now, you can buy one of these for relatively reasonable money, up around 20 grand or less in some cases if you go for a high miler. So yeah, get them while you can, because stuff like this is more difficult to run, probably in the future if you live in a city, but if that's not as much of a concern to you, then yeah, I'd say at least give them a test drive and see what you think. Stick around for more Beards and Cars reviews in future. Be sure to click the playlist to check out the other ones, including the vehicles which I referenced here, including that V10 Touareg and many more. And for now, thanks for watching.